Report.
Good morning, I'm Michelle Franzen in New York. We are coming on the air with breaking news from the Middle East.
The war with Iran is now entering its 13th day, with all sides escalating military.
Good evening. I'm reporting to you from our newsroom at a moment when the geopolitical landscape of the entire eastern Cordoba region has fundamentally shifted in the span of 4 hours.
We are following some breaking news out of Iran after Iran threatens President Trump.
At 2:47 a.m. local time, the nation of Valdez launched a coordinated military strike against the neighboring state of Kurdistan. What began as a surgical operation has evolved into a full-scale regional crisis with implications that extend far beyond the borders of either nation. We are still in the opening hours of this conflict. The death toll is climbing, the diplomatic channels are collapsing, and the leader of Kurdistan, the man whose decisions set this entire sequence in motion, has not been seen or confirmed since the first missile struck. This is what we know at this moment. This is what remains unknown. And this is why what happens in the next 72 hours will reshape global energy markets, fracture Western alliances, and determine whether this crisis becomes a contained regional conflict or something far more consequential. At 2:47 a.m. Eastern Cordoba Standard Time, multiple radar stations across Kurdistan detected an inbound strike package. The initial count, 114 ballistic missiles launched from Valdesian territory. 114 warheads assigned simultaneously to military installations, air defense batteries, command and control centers, and critical infrastructure facilities spread across Kurdistan's industrial heartland. The Valdesian Air Force followed with 73 cruise missile strikes and sustained drone operations that continued through the dawn hours. By 5:33 a.m., when the primary wave concluded, the Kurdistan Defense Ministry had recorded direct strikes on the Kashan Air Base, the Bushehr Naval Facility, the Tabriz Missile Production Complex, the Awaz Oil Refinery, and the Bandar Abbas Export Terminal. Initial damage assessments, and I want to emphasize that these are preliminary, suggest destruction of air defense systems, significant structural damage to military command facilities, and complete loss of at least 4 major radar installations. But the strike package tells a different story than the official damage counts. The targeting pattern reveals something that military analysts are only beginning to understand. The strikes were not distributed, they were concentrated. Valdez was not attempting to degrade Kurdistan's entire military capacity. Valdez was attempting to achieve one specific objective with overwhelming force. The question that every intelligence service on the planet is asking this morning is, did they succeed? The Kurdistan government issued its first statement at 6:14 a.m. The Defense Ministry confirmed strike damage. The government announced that air defense systems had engaged the incoming missiles, that most of the strike package had been degraded or deflected, and that Kurdistan had sustained manageable damage with acceptable casualties. Those were the official words. Acceptable casualties. By 7 a.m., Kurdistan's health ministry had issued a revised casualty estimate. 237 dead, 419 injured. By 8:30 a.m., hospitals in the southern industrial zone reported they were beyond capacity. By noon, that number had climbed to 618 confirmed dead, with no final count yet available. But here is the detail that changes everything about how this strike will be understood in the coming hours and days. The Kurdistan government did not confirm the status of Prime Minister Alexander Vasovic. At the moment the strike package was launched, Vasovic was at a secure government compound in the capital city of Corsica, approximately 47 kilometers from the primary strike zone. According to official Kurdistan sources, the secure facility sustained no direct hits. According to those same sources, Vasovic is alive, unharmed, and in full command of the government response. Except Vasovic has not appeared publicly. Not in a video address. Not in a television interview. Not in a single verified time-stamped image confirming his presence, his health, or his continued authority. Kurdistan's wartime information protocols, implemented this year in anticipation of exactly this scenario, permit the government to restrict all media access to government facilities, to control the release of damage assessments, and to maintain operational security around leadership continuity. Under those protocols, the Kurdistan government is not required to produce visual evidence of the prime minister's status. It is legally permitted to operate in a mode of complete informational opacity. What this means in practical terms is this. Governments allied with Kurdistan cannot confirm with absolute certainty that the man who authorized this conflict's escalation is still in operational command of the state. The president of the Western Alliance cannot reach across secure phone lines and speak directly to a verified counterpart. Intelligence agencies cannot confirm chain of command continuity. And Valdez, watching the silence from Corsica with extreme attention, is drawing conclusions from what is not being said. Let me introduce you to someone. Brigadier General Marcus Webb has spent 23 years in military intelligence. He served 3 deployments to conflict zones. He briefed 3 administrations on Eastern Cordoba regional dynamics. He has a reputation for reading the intelligence picture without the filter of what his superiors want to hear. 6 hours ago, Webb was recalled to the Pentagon Operations Center. He was given access to satellite imagery from the strike, intercepts from Valdesian communications, and preliminary damage assessments from Allied intelligence services. He sat in front of a secure screen at 8:17 a.m. and began cross-referencing the targeting data against the actual strike locations. What Webb found is not in any public statement. It is not in any press briefing. It exists only in a classified after-action analysis sitting in a secure server, accessible only to personnel with the appropriate clearance. The targeting package Valdez deployed was not accurate to within 50 meters. It was accurate to within 12 meters. The missiles did not simply strike the Khoristan Defense Ministry complex. They struck the command bunker, the secure communications vault, and the backup power generation facility in a pattern that suggests not luck but intelligence of extraordinary precision. The Valdesian military did not simply attack Khoristan. The Valdesian military attacked Khoristan's ability to respond to that attack. Here is what troubles General Webb. The secure government compound where Vasovic was supposedly protected is located 2.3 kilometers from the Tabriz missile production complex. The strike on Tabriz was the second largest warhead deployment in the entire package. When Webb pulled the satellite imagery and examined the blast radius, the damage zone, and the thermal signature of the detonation, he found something that should not exist in that location. A secondary structure, not listed on any Khoristan government facility database, showing structural damage consistent with near-proximity blast effect. Webb has not filed his analysis. Webb has not briefed his superiors on what the imagery suggests. Webb has not made any formal statement about what that secondary structure might be or why it existed in that location, because to do so would mean stating a conclusion that he cannot verify and that, if accurate, would mean that the Khoristan government is actively concealing something far more significant than routine wartime damage assessments. At 10:43 a.m., Valdez issued a formal statement. The Valdesian Defense Ministry claimed that its strike package had achieved all primary objectives. The statement did not specify what those objectives were. The statement did not claim the death or incapacitation of any specific target. The statement simply announced success and warned that additional strikes would follow if Khoristan did not cease all military operations and enter into immediate negotiations. The Khoristan government's response came at 11:12 a.m. A written statement from the Defense Ministry, attributed to senior military leadership, announced that Khoristan would respond to the Valdesian aggression with overwhelming force. The statement promised strikes on Valdesian military installations, economic infrastructure, and civilian targets if Valdez did not immediately cease operations. The statement made no reference to Prime Minister Vasovic. It made no reference to any government decision-making authority beyond the Defense Ministry itself. By noon, analysts in Washington, London, Berlin, and Paris had noted the same detail. Khoristan's responses to the strike were coming from military channels, not from government channels. The Defense Ministry was speaking. The Prime Minister's office was silent. At 1:15 p.m., the Western Alliance attempted direct contact with the Khoristan government. The call was placed to the Prime Minister's secure line. The call was not answered. A second attempt was made at 1:47 p.m. Again, no answer. The Western Alliance then contacted the Defense Minister. The Defense Minister confirmed that he was alive, unharmed, and in command of Khoristan's military response. The Defense Minister did not confirm the status of the Prime Minister. When pressed directly on that question, the Defense Minister stated that the Prime Minister was managing the broader government response and was not available for direct communication at this time. Not available for communication. In the opening hours of a full-scale military conflict with a neighboring state. With 114 ballistic missiles already in the ground and more strikes threatened. With global oil markets moving upward in real time. With the Western Alliance attempting to broker a ceasefire. Not available for communication. Here is what you need to understand about what that silence means. When a government is transparent about its leader's status, it is because transparency serves the government's interests. It reassures allies. It demonstrates continuity. It sends a signal that the state is functioning normally despite the crisis around it. When a government maintains silence about its leader's status during a military conflict, the silence itself becomes data. The silence tells every intelligence service watching that something is being managed. The question is what? At 2:33 p.m. local time, the first Khoristan retaliation began. Long-range ballistic missiles launched from positions in northern Khoristan targeted Valdez's primary air base. The strike was not as precise as the Valdesian strike had been. 3 of 7 missiles were intercepted by Valdesian air defense systems. 4 missiles reached their targets. The Valdesian air base sustained significant damage. Hangar structures were destroyed. Aircraft were lost on the tarmac. Preliminary reports suggest 112 Valdesian military personnel were killed in the strike. That number matters. 112. The same order of magnitude as the civilian casualties Khoristan had sustained. The same scale of loss reflected back at the aggressor state. This is not an accident. This is a message. This is Khoristan telling Valdez that the cost of this conflict will not be borne by Khoristan alone. But the retaliation raises a new question. The missiles that struck the Valdesian airbase were launched under whose authority? The defense minister controlled the launch decision. The defense minister made that choice. The defense minister did not consult with the prime minister because the prime minister was not available. And in a conflict of this scale, that absence of consultation is itself a form of civilian-military fracture that no government can sustain for more than a few hours before the entire command structure begins to fragment. In the city of Tabriz, in a neighborhood 3 kilometers from the missile production complex, there is a hospital. The hospital was built in 1987. It was designed to handle approximately 300 patients per day under normal conditions. By 2 p.m. today, the emergency department was processing 407 patients. By 3:15 p.m., that number had grown to 682. The hospital has 12 emergency surgeons. 3 of them were off-site when the strike occurred. 9 surgeons are now working in 12-hour rotations without relief. The backup power generator is running. It was designed to operate for 72 hours at full capacity. If the strikes continue, if more patients arrive, if the primary power grid remains offline, the backup generator will fail before this night ends. There is a doctor in that hospital. Her name is Dr. Sarah Mentis. She has worked in emergency medicine for 18 years. She has trained for mass casualty events. She has read the protocols. She has practiced the procedures. At 2:47 p.m., when the first casualty arrived, she was ready. By 3 p.m., she was no longer ready. By 3:30 p.m., she was operating on a child who should never have been injured in the first place. The child had been in a school building 4 blocks from the missile complex. The blast wave had traveled through the neighborhood. The child's injuries are survivable if the hospital maintains power, maintains staffing, and maintains access to the medications that are already running low. Dr. Mentis does not know about General Webb's satellite analysis. She does not know about the unanswered phone calls to the Prime Minister's office. She does not know about the Defense Minister's careful non-answer when asked about Vasovic status. She knows only that she has 14 people who will die if the backup power fails, that she has 6 hours of surgery ahead of her, and that somewhere above her head, more missiles might still be coming. That is the war that the military briefings do not capture. That is the cost that the damage assessments do not quantify. That is the moment when the strategic calculations of government officials meet the irreversible human reality of the decisions those officials make. By 4 p.m., the Western Alliance had made a decision. The president of the Western Alliance would not wait for confirmation of Vasovic status. The president would not wait for the Prime Minister's office to become available. The president would deploy a personal envoy to Corsica immediately. The envoy would carry a message from the Western Alliance. This conflict must end. A ceasefire must be established within the next 12 hours. The terms of that ceasefire would be negotiated, but the essential demand was clear. No more strikes. No more escalation. A path to negotiation must be established before this conflict crosses the threshold into something neither side can control. The envoy's flight departed at 4:47 p.m. The flight time to Corsica is 8 hours. The envoy would arrive at 12:47 a.m. local time. By that time, the Western Alliance calculated, Vasovic would either have appeared publicly to confirm his status, or his absence would have created a vacuum so complete that the entire Khoristan government structure would be in transition. Either outcome would be catastrophic for the Western Alliance's exit strategy. At 5:15 p.m., something unexpected happened. The Khoristan Defense Ministry issued a new statement. The statement announced that Prime Minister Alexander Vasovic had authorized a coordinated response to Valdesian aggression. The statement quoted Vasovic directly. The statement provided details of the government's negotiating position. The statement was attributed to the Prime Minister's office. But the statement contained no video, no photograph, no verification of when Vasovic had issued these instructions, no confirmation of where he was, what his condition was, or whether he was issuing orders in real time or whether these orders had been issued hours earlier and were only now being released by his staff. The statement was text, pure text, attributed to a man whose face had not been seen since the missiles began falling. Here is what I want you to understand about the architecture of information in a conflict like this. When a government restricts media access under wartime protocols, when a government implements blackouts on leadership status, when a government controls the flow of all official communication, the government gains the ability to shape the narrative. The government also loses the ability to prove it. Any statement attributed to the Prime Minister becomes subject to the question, is this issued now, or was this issued hours ago? Is this authorized by the current Prime Minister, or by someone claiming to speak on his behalf? Is this the will of the government, or is this the will of the military, Or is this the compromise that emerges when the government cannot be reached? The Khoristan government had created a situation in which it could say anything and defend that statement through the same operational security that prevented verification. The Khoristan government could claim that Vesovic was alive and in command, and no one outside the government could definitively prove otherwise. But the Khoristan government could also create that claim without Vesovic's knowledge or involvement, and no one outside the government could prove that either. This is the weapon that Khoristan had constructed for itself. The weapon is called ambiguity. And ambiguity, deployed at this level of sophistication, is more powerful than the missiles themselves. By 6:30 p.m., the global impact of the conflict had become impossible to ignore. Oil prices had moved upward by 12% in a single day. The Strait of Cordoba, the waterway through which 20% of the world's oil supply flows under normal conditions, was being assessed for closure. Insurance companies were withdrawing coverage for vessels transiting the strait. Shipping companies were rerouting vessels around the African continent, adding weeks to transit times and billions to supply chain costs. Japan, South Korea, India, and Europe were issuing emergency statements about energy security. The International Monetary Fund was holding emergency sessions to assess the economic impact. Global financial markets were in the process of recalibrating to a world in which regional stability in eastern Cordoba could no longer be assumed. The economic shock was beginning to propagate outward from the immediate conflict zone. Every hour that the conflict continued without resolution would compound that shock. Every hour that the prime minister's status remained unconfirmed would deepen the uncertainty that was driving the market movements. And every hour that the Western alliance remained unable to broker a ceasefire would extend the timeline of the shock into something that no economic model could sustain indefinitely. At 7 p.m., General Webb filed his analysis. Webb reported to his superiors that the Valdesian strike pattern was consistent with an attempt to eliminate a specific target, not to degrade military capacity in general. Webb reported that the secondary structure near the government compound showed damage patterns inconsistent with industrial facilities. Webb reported that the silence around the prime minister's status was consistent with a government in transition, not a government operating under normal continuity. Webb's superiors reviewed his analysis. They did not refute it. They also did not act on it. They classified it. They compartmented it. They told General Webb to wait for further guidance. By 7:45 p.m., the Western media had begun to report on the silence around Vesovic's status. News organizations were quoting intelligence sources. Sources were describing the unconfirmed nature of Vesovic's condition. Sources were speculating about succession scenarios. Sources were raising questions about whether the Khoristan government was actually in control or whether the defense ministry had effectively seized command during the crisis. The Khoristan government responded at 8:12 p.m. by cutting off all media access to government facilities and by announcing that all journalists would be subject to arrest if they continued to speculate about the prime minister's status. This action, designed to suppress the narrative about Vesovic's ambiguous condition, had the opposite effect. The restriction confirmed what the silence had already suggested. Something was being hidden. The government would not hide something unless that something mattered. By 9 p.m., the Western Alliance had issued a public statement calling for an immediate ceasefire. The statement was addressed to both Valdez and Khoristan. The statement warned that the conflict would result in regional destabilization, economic collapse, and humanitarian catastrophe if it continued. The statement offered the Western Alliance's full support for any negotiation framework that would end the military operations. The Valdesian government responded within 30 minutes. Valdez would agree to a ceasefire on condition that Khoristan cease all military operations and enter into negotiations regarding Valdez's security concerns. The statement was clear. Valdez was willing to stop if Khoristan would stop. The Khoristan government's response came at 10:15 p.m. The response stated that Khoristan would not agree to any ceasefire that did not include guarantees regarding Valdesian military posture. The response stated that Khoristan would continue military operations until Valdez agreed to international supervision of Valdesian military facilities. The response was attributed to the Prime Minister's office. But it was issued at 10:15 p.m., 18 hours after the first strike, 18 hours after the Prime Minister was supposed to be managing the government response. 18 hours into a conflict in which the government's primary leader had not been seen or verified. At 10:47 p.m., the Western Alliance's envoy's aircraft was 1 hour from landing in Corsica. The envoy was preparing remarks for the government officials who would meet him at the airport. The envoy was preparing for the scenario in which Vesovic appeared, alive, healthy, ready to negotiate. The envoy was also preparing for the scenario in which Vesovic did not appear. In that scenario, the envoy would be negotiating with a government in transition, with unclear command authority, and with a military structure that might or might not acknowledge the civilian government's decisions. The envoy's preparation included a contingency plan. If Vesovic was confirmed dead or incapacitated, the Western Alliance would immediately recognize the successor government, would provide guarantees regarding Valdez's security concerns, and would broker a ceasefire based on the reality of Khorastan's actual command structure, not on the fiction that a government in transition could speak with unified authority. That plan was classified. That plan was not shared with Khorastan's government. That plan was waiting in the envoy's briefing package as a contingency that would only be deployed if the worst-case scenario materialized. At 11:30 p.m., just before the envoy's aircraft was scheduled to land, Khorastan's government released a video. The video showed Prime Minister Alexander Vaisovic. Vaisovic was seated at an official desk. Vaisovic was speaking directly to the camera. Vaisovic's appearance was composed, professional, and unambiguous. Vaisovic announced that he had authorized Khorastan's military response. Vaisovic announced that the government of Khoristan would not cease operations until Valdez agreed to international supervision. Vaisovic announced that the Western Alliance's intervention was welcomed and that Khoristan would participate in any negotiation framework that the Western Alliance proposed. The video was timestamped. The timestamp indicated that the video had been recorded at 11:15 p.m., 17 minutes before the envoy's aircraft landed, 34 minutes before midnight. But here is the detail that General Webb noticed when he reviewed the video footage. The background behind Vaisovic showed a window. Through that window, it was daylight. The timestamp said 11:15 p.m. The background showed broad daylight. The video had been recorded earlier in the day. The video had been recorded before the strikes occurred, or hours after they occurred when the daylight was at its strongest. The video had been recorded at a time that would have made sense given Vaisovic's schedule on a normal day. The video had not been recorded at 11:15 p.m. The video had been recorded much earlier. Someone had chosen to release it at 11:15 p.m., 18.5 hours after the first missile struck, in order to create the appearance of real-time authority at the exact moment when the Western Alliance's envoy was landing. Webb did not file another report. Webb did not brief his superiors on the timestamp discrepancy. Webb understood what he was observing. He understood the specific architecture of information management that was being deployed. He understood that the Khoristan government was operating under conditions in which real-time confirmation of leadership status was not possible, and that the government was therefore constructing the appearance of that confirmation through pre-recorded statements released at strategically significant moments. The envoy landed at 12:47 a.m. The envoy was met by Khoristan's deputy foreign minister. The deputy foreign minister confirmed that the prime minister was alive, well, and ready to negotiate. The deputy foreign minister did not offer to arrange a meeting. The deputy foreign minister did not offer to facilitate direct communication. The deputy foreign minister offered only the assurance that the prime minister was in command and that any agreement the envoy negotiated with the Khoristan government would be honored by the government that the prime minister controlled. The envoy accepted this assurance. The envoy had no other option. The envoy could not demand to see the prime minister. The envoy could not insist on direct verification. The envoy could only proceed with the assumption that the government he was negotiating with was the government it claimed to be, led by the man who had authorized the decisions that had put Khoristan into this conflict in the first place. By 1:30 a.m. on the second day, negotiations had begun. The Western Alliance presented a ceasefire framework. Valdez presented its security conditions. Khoristan presented its demands regarding international supervision. All three parties were negotiating with incomplete information about the other party's actual decision-making authority. Valdez did not know whether Khoristan's government was stable or in transition. The Western Alliance did not know whether the man it was negotiating with had the authority to commit Khoristan to a ceasefire. Khoristan did not know whether Valdez was negotiating in good faith or whether Valdez was using the negotiation period to prepare for a second wave of strikes. This is the condition that General Webb had identified in his classified analysis. This is the moment when the silence becomes more dangerous than the missiles. This is the moment when a government's inability to confirm its leader's status becomes the central fact shaping an entire conflict's trajectory. In the hospital in Tabriz, Dr. Sarah Mentis was 18 hours into continuous surgery. The backup power generator was showing strain. One of the 12 emergency surgeons had collapsed from exhaustion and had been sent to rest. 11 surgeons were now managing the patient load. The supply of medications was running at 30% capacity. The supply of blood was running at 40%. The patient mortality rate in the emergency department had climbed to 7.3%, far above the baseline rate of 0.8% that the hospital normally experienced. Dr. Mentis had not slept. Dr. Mentis had not eaten. Dr. Mentis was operating on a 16-year-old girl whose injuries were survivable only if the hospital maintained power, maintained staffing, and maintained access to the medications that were running out. Dr. Mentis did not know that the Prime Minister's video had been pre-recorded. Dr. Mentis did not know that the negotiations were proceeding under conditions of ambiguity regarding the Khoristan government's actual authority. Dr. Mentis knew only that if the strikes continued, if more patients arrived, if the power failed, the girl on the operating table would die. By 2 a.m., the first ceasefire agreement had been drafted. The agreement proposed a 24-hour military pause. During that pause, both Valdez and Khoristan would refrain from military operations. During that pause, international observers would be deployed to monitor compliance. During that pause, the three parties would negotiate the framework for a longer-term settlement. Valdez agreed to the ceasefire at 2:15 a.m. Khoristan agreed to the ceasefire at 2:47 a.m., exactly 24 hours after the first missile had struck. The Western Alliance announced the ceasefire agreement at 3 a.m. The missiles stopped. The drones returned to base. The aircraft stood down. The silence that followed was absolute. The silence that follows all wars in the first moments after the guns fall quiet. In Tabriz, Dr. Mentis continued operating on the 16-year-old girl. The power held. The medications were held. The surgeon's hands held steady. At 3:47 a.m., the girl's injuries had been as fully addressed as current medical science allowed. The girl would live. The girl would recover. The girl would carry the scars of this night for the rest of her life, but she would live. What you have witnessed in these hours is not a military conflict between two states. What you have witnessed is a crisis in information, a crisis in authority, and a crisis in the basic certainty that governments require in order to function. The weapons deployed were real. The casualties were real. The suffering was real. But the conflict itself was shaped not by what happened in the air, but by what could not be confirmed on the ground. Valdez struck because he believed the moment was right. Khoristan could not respond with unified authority because the man who should have unified that response was either dead, injured, or unreachable. The Western Alliance could not broker a ceasefire until it was certain that the government it was negotiating with could actually commit to that ceasefire. And the entire conflict was conducted under conditions of ambiguity so complete that every decision made by every government was made on the basis of incomplete information. This is the geopolitical reality of modern conflict. This is what happens when military capability advances faster than diplomatic infrastructure. This is what emerges when governments have the power to strike but lack the certainty required to negotiate an end to the striking. The ceasefire will hold. The negotiations will continue. The Western Alliance will broker an agreement that both Valdez and Khoristan can accept, but the agreement they reach will be shaped not by military victory or defeat, but by the accumulated weight of uncertainty, the economic cost of sustained conflict, and the basic human need for the missiles to stop. And somewhere in the Khoristan government, someone knows the truth about what happened to Prime Minister Alexander Vasovic. Someone knows whether he authorized this conflict with full knowledge of where it would lead. Someone knows whether he has survived this night intact. But that someone is maintaining the same silence that has shaped every decision of the last 24 hours. The silence will eventually break. The truth will eventually surface. But by then, the conflict will be over. The terms will be negotiated. The agreement will be signed. And the man who authorized this war, if he is still alive, will be governing a nation that has been forever changed by the consequences of his decision. This is a fictional story. Every name, every official, every specific event described has been entirely invented for dramatic storytelling purposes. The nations, the military operations, and the geopolitical dynamics reflected in this narrative are fictional constructions. They are not real events. They did not happen, but they could happen. And that possibility is the reason stories like this are told.